Hello, everyone. My name is Preethi. I'm a UX researcher from the Jetpack Compose team.
And I'm Chris Sinco, design lead on the Jetpack Compose team.
And today we are going to talk about how the community is helping shape Jetpack Compose. In May 2019, we announced an early preview of Jetpack Compose, which is a modern UI toolkit that was designed to help build beautiful apps quickly and easily. Flash forward, we recently released the alpha version. Now, the Jetpack Compose team was very clear from the very beginning that we invested in more like a developer-centered product and engaged with the community to gather feedback, so we are building the right product for our developers. Hence, UX research and design formed like the core of Compose's development right from its very early stages. The developer community has been super active in exploring and sharing feedback on social channels. And it's almost like a shout out to all of you out there. This has been immensely helpful for the Jetpack Compose team to make improvements. However, aside from this organically rich developer ecosystem that has been ever growing, our team has also had a dedicated UX process. And in today's talk, we will share how we have applied UX research and design principles to not only understand developer needs and perceptions, but also sort of apply our learnings to improve the product. We will share some stories on how we drew on research to inform the product design. We'll also talk a bit about some of the strategies that we learned along the way for us to be able to capture meaningful and actionable insights in this pretty complex space. Our hope is that this talk will shed some light on how your feedback has influenced improvements to Jetpack Compose. We also hope that we will inspire you to adopt some of the strategies when applying user research in your product. A lot of companies do not necessarily focus on developer-centered research and design, but something that we would like to demonstrate here is that the strategies that we'll be sharing in this talk may be applied to consumer products as well. So let's get started. To start, we will talk about the framework that we have been applying to our UX process. Now, the foundation of this framework is that we respect our users. And by that, what we mean is it is super critical for us to have clarity on the primary user goals that we are attempting to solve. And this would mean that we really ensure that we are building on top of like users' past experiences and expectations, so that we are sort of maintaining this form of continuity and offering for more delightful developer experience. Now, on top of this, there were actually 3 pillars that we were considering, each one sort of complementing the other. And these include designing intuitive APIs, building tools that sort of support the consumption of these APIs, and offering guidance that assists the developers to rapidly learn the concepts underlying Jetpack Compose. Today, what we are going to do is we are going to briefly share some examples of how the feedback from the community has helped inform each of these pillars. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand off to Chris at this point to sort of talk about how we designed Compose tutorial.
Thanks, Preethi. So today we're going to talk about the Compose tutorial, or one of the stories. So the tutorial, for those who aren't familiar, it launched back for the developer preview in late 2019 on developer.android.com. The idea was that it's a quick intro really for early adopters at the time and curious developers to dive into Compose and figure out like, why is it new? What is it about? The approach we wanted here was something that was unique to the site that we haven't done before, something that's more modern with just the design and the presentation. But also, besides the visual aspect, we wanted to actually approach this type of guidance or tutorial differently from how we've done it in the past, where we wanted to structure the content to be more well-paced in terms of like learning new things, but also be more opinionated about what are the next things to go learn once you've completed the tutorial. Next. So before we jumped into the design, we had drawn upon previous research that we had done on some of the other Jetpack pages on developer.android.com. What we found in previous research was, often developers will skim content because they're trying to find things quickly. attention grabbers are often code snippets, clear titles and headers that say words like getting started or about, but also just visuals, of course, that draw people's eyes. But the other thing is that, we found that developers, and this might seem obvious, but they really like hands-on learning with samples within the browser, not necessarily within Android Studio. And kind of to the point about attention grabbers, people just said, hey, just more and more code, please. But considering all these things, like one thing we did observe is like sometimes we don't quite have the right messaging or structure. And so often people will use literally Control F to find things because they can't find the right words on the page. So we took all that consideration in terms of how we designed the tutorial. And so the approach, kind of like two high-level things. One is we wanted to showcase what's possible with Compose without setup, which is an important piece because I think with Compose, there's a lot of new things, and we didn't want people to necessarily have to set up Android Studio or their machine in any specific way to learn about Compose in the beginning. And then to the learning thing, the second part of the approach was we wanted to provide clear steps during the tutorial and after so that people know how to continue learning about Compose once they've gone through the tutorial. So, a few design aspects I'll call out in the tutorial design. One thing to, as previous about providing clear direction while you're learning is the goals are very clear up front. At the very top, you see a summary of what you would expect in this lesson. We did consider adding like a time limit. We have those in Code Labs, but for the tutorial, it was a little ambiguous what that really meant, so we decided to omit it. But also which is kind of in this zooming GIF over here, having a clear outline that developers could scan and navigate at their pace, just so they knew up front how long the lesson was and what were the actual discrete steps within them. The second, next slide. Second aspect to call out was, so for every step, we really wanted to have it focus on a specific concept, but have each step build on top of each other. So every step was progressive, but it also showed like the description of like what you were learning, and then showed you the code snippet, and then actually a preview of what that code generated. And so that was important because, again, to the point of like not having setup, we didn't want, people could still follow along within Android Studio by copy pasting these snippets, but we didn't see that as something needed or required to actually learn about Compose in the beginning. And so, with these ideas, like we wanted to get feedback from developers to say like, does this paradigm or this new design actually align with some of the developers' expectations when they're learning Compose? And so to do that, we brought folks into our San Francisco labs. Oh, is it on the next slide? Oh, I see. And so we had an in-person usability session. And so during the session, developers were asked to think aloud. And this is kind of a typical protocol that we do have for usability sessions. But at the same time, so Preethi was the researcher in the room. She would ask them clarifying questions as well, while the rest of the team was silently observing through the video call. And so, this kind of a summary of the feedback, but like really, I think the tutorial resonated well with folks. It was clear that they liked it in a step-by-step approach with working examples. It was nice to see code side by side with the preview. It just made it much more approachable and clear for people. I think the one thing though that we did learn, which we'll get into the next slide, is people weren't sure like, okay, now that I've gone through this tutorial, what am I supposed to do next? And so back to what we had discussed in the approach, we decided, okay, let's make sure we have clear next steps for continued learning. So one aspect of that was summarizing what you had just learned in the tutorial, both from an API standpoint, and also on the bottom, like having an actual contextual curated list of resources to look into next. So in this case, we showed like the pathway, and also some links to sample apps on GitHub and some specific guides like around layout and theming, which were things that were covered in the tutorial. So based on that, I think the tutorial was successful. Some things we want to consider for the future, we want to expand tutorials. I think the format worked well. So one thing we've thought is, can we expand this to other Jetpack areas or different aspects of Compose for folks? The other thing is, the minimal setup experience was great. I think people found that it was awesome that they could learn in the browser without having to configure Android Studio or their machine in any specific way. We really want to lean into that more, especially when people are learning new technologies, such as new Jetpack libraries. And so we're thinking like, how can we apply that to other aspects of the learning? And then also related to learning, like contextual learning, I think once people have gone through tutorials or guides on DAC, it's like, how do we bring that learning more in context to the project or problem you're working on directly in your IDE? And so that's just something else that we want to expand into in terms of developer learning. And with that, I'll bring it back to Preethi, who will discuss layout modifiers.
Great. Thanks, Chris. That's an interesting story. So let's talk about layout modifiers now. And I'm going to talk about how some of the early feedback from the community really influenced critical changes to the API. And for that, we may have to time travel. So let's go back to like late summer 2019. So back then, early on, composables were used to specify how to lay out something. So for instance, here you would use a composable such as padding that's been added around like a text component. And with this early design, what we wanted to do was we basically wanted to validate that whether this aligned with developers' understanding, especially when working with like layout composables such as padding. So we continue to use the similar, UX research study format that Chris described earlier with how we capture feedback on Compose tutorial. So this was very much like an in-person coding session. We invited developers from the Bay Area to come in. We already had like a machine with Android Studio and like a starter project setup. And what developers had to do was basically they would review like a sample and they will add some more code to reflect something like a design mock that was provided to them. And again, they did this by thinking aloud as they went about coding. And I was acting more like this talking fly on the wall who would be asking this clarifying questions while the rest of the team would silently observe via like a remote video call. Something that really stood out that got called out very often in these research sessions was that padding as a component of its own was not very intuitive to how developers actually thought about padding in XML. Because for them, padding was something like an attribute or a parameter that would be set for a component. In addition, we also started to observe that it was unclear to developers as to how to implement padding in the first place. So a common question that got raised by developers was, what would happen in the situation if one applied padding like the code in here? So there's padding that's around two text components. Does this mean that the padding is around both the text components, or would it be that it's going to be around one of them? How is the text going to be laid out? Is it going to be vertically oriented or is it going to be horizontally oriented? And all of this was ambiguous, right? So what was happening here is that padding was operating in this context where it had multiple children, which sort of required a developer to specify how each of this child was laid out. But padding, when it was defined earlier, it didn't have this definition for a correct usage based on this example. And it also kind of makes it difficult to differentiate padding from a column in this case, right? So all of this ambiguity sort of made the experience difficult and confusing for developers. A key takeaway for our team from this research was that we needed to sort of rethink how Compose can help developers intuitively manipulate layout-related parameters. All of this sort of while ensuring that we wrote that they wrote less code. Right? And our very fantastic engineering team, they landed on this concept of modifiers. What modifiers did was it basically adapted the concept of layout params from the classic view system. And so in this case, if one wanted to express padding, they can do that as an object of its own, which can then be passed as a parameter. So going back to the previous example we had before, padding would now be called as a modifier instead, which is clearly applied to the column, which would mean that it's actually taking up space around the text elements. Now, this kind of really provides clarity and it simplifies understanding. It sort of allows the developers to change several of these modifiers to produce like a final measurement and a layout that has been desired. So for instance, I have an example here. So one can chain like multiple modifiers using the plus operator. So when this is read in English, it would read as, add a text component to fit in the layout of like 40 dp, add like a background of solid green, all while ensuring that the size of the text component is 20 dp. One of the key concepts that was baked in this library was that the order in which the modifier was specified really mattered. Now, while the team was super excited about this new concept, we were also interested to know what the community thought about it, right? Which is why we went back to gathering feedback from the community. Now, we knew that this idea of ordering modifiers can trip up developers until it has been learned like over time, or it comes with like practice. But we still wanted to validate if modifiers as a concept can be grabbed. And we did uncover interesting insights that led to like rethinking or making some critical changes to modifiers. But before I share more about that, I would like to shed some light on what the UX team learned from research perspective. Now, the UX team actually learned quite a bit from having this kind of in-person coding session. Like for instance, having developers explore and code in person was super valuable, right? So we were able to sort of watch and learn how developers approached Android development in general, and also, specifically using libraries like modifiers. And this also kind of opened up this opportunity for having these kind of organic conversations on topics that we had originally not set out to learn. However, what it did was it kind of limited participation only to developers in the Bay Area. And so we started to wonder, how can we scale this Compose research so that we can hear from developers outside of San Francisco? And the next thing was, indeed, the study encouraged developers to spend like a quick 1 hour away from their work so they could quickly come in, share their feedback. In fact, we actually heard a few mention to us that, they really appreciated being able to share their opinion and see it reflected in the product a few months later. Now, having a machine with the setup already completed and all they had to do was just, start up with like a project and work on top of that, that was actually really welcomed by most of our developers. And we often heard loud and clear that, it can take a lot of time to set up the development environment before one can actually get started with exploring Compose. Now, all of this worked out great, but then on the other hand, what was happening was this form of gathering feedback did not really offer much room for developers to play around with the API, explore and experiment before they could articulate and share their feedback. And so we, in trying to understand developers' reaction to modifiers, the UX team sort of started to take on a different approach. We wanted to hear developers' thoughts from around the world, and we also wanted to give that extra time for people to explore and experiment before they shared their feedback. So there were two things that we were trying to play with. And so we chose to use the homework paradigm, wherein developers were given these kind of mini tasks that they can work on as a homework for over a week. And then following this, we invited them for like a video meeting where we had them share their code and talk to us about their experience. Now, going back to what we actually learned with this, the concept of modifiers and the concept of ordering and using the chaining mechanism using the plus operator, the very first red flag we saw that got called out was the usage of the plus operator. Right. So while many developers associated plus with the concept of addition, they were sort of expecting to see something like a compound result. There were some who thought plus is more like an overriding operation. And so they were expecting to see the code behave based on like the most recent modifier that gets appended to like a list. Further, because plus was being associated with this kind of commutative operation with like numbers, many assumed that order did not really matter, which was kind of incorrect. And all of this sort of led to this kind of confusing experience. So for instance, in this code here, while some thought that replicating modifier twice, like in this case with the draw background, it didn't actually make sense to some, while others thought that having this kind of plus operator would mean you're either overriding a previous value or you're producing like a compounded result. So in this case, the background color would either be green or it would be like a solid blue-green. And so all of this sort of led to more ambiguity. One other thing we also observed was developers expressed frustrations, especially when it came to like indenting the code, like formatting, long list of modifiers, and all of these were some of the pain points that we were able to uncover during this research study. As expected, ordering was seen as confusing by most. We heard several talk about this kind of cognitive overload that will be introduced while coding, not to mention like some of the difficulties that people express with knowing when order actually mattered or influenced the outcome. So modifier was in general, it was perceived by most as like a single entity, and hence the most common feedback that we heard was people thought that adding modifier in the end, when there is a list, would be most helpful, especially when they wanted to like quickly iterate. And to sort of make matters more complicated, we also heard this need for kind of tooling support. So for instance, there were some people who were talking about like refactoring, some assistance from like code completion, and all of these that were currently not already being offered in Studio that sort of hindered how one would manipulate modifiers. So based on some of these takeaways, our team had to work on improvements to modifiers. We had to like think about how we can allow tweaking the presentation of a composable. And what the team did was they modified they defined the modifiers as Kotlin extension methods instead. So what that means is by making this improvement, one can actually chain like a bunch of these modifiers together to sort of compose them. And this sort of also allowed this opportunity for attaching callback events, like in this case here, to composables by defining them within the modifier. So for instance, in this code here, there are these bunch of modifiers that are used together, and there's this clickable callback. Now, what extension methods really did was it allowed for improving namespace, and in turn, it sort of assisted with bettering the autocomplete feature in the IDE. Order still matters though. The explicit order sort of helps one to reason about how different modifiers will interact, and it kind of gives more control to achieve the exact behavior. Now, we are actually not going to go into details of why we chose to go with that design decision and why we are still sticking to that, but I would encourage folks on this call to visit the developer website to learn more about the design decisions around why we made this a requirement. Now, from UX research perspective, the homework paradigm actually really worked out well. Right? It allowed more time for exploration. It sort of also led to this kind of collaborative API research. So we were basically collaborating with developers and trying to understand what were some of the places that an API or a library worked out well. What are some of the expectations that were being met, and are there things that we are aligning, or are there any pain points or friction areas that we need to iron out? But moving forward, one of the things we started to realize was 1 week may not be enough. It's great if it is like mini tasks that people are working on, but can we extend it a bit further? Can we make it so that people are actually working on mini projects instead? And so can we extend the time duration from like a week to maybe like 3 to 4 weeks, so that when someone works on an entire project that involves multiple concepts, it could provide for more like a whole rounded experience that people can share about. And then we would pair this, and then so we sort of landed on like the diary research paradigm. So people would basically keep diaries of their experience as they went about working with Compose, and then we would invite developers for like a follow-up video call to sort of create this opportunity to have deeper conversations. With that, I'm going to hand off to Chris again to talk about another story.
Thanks, Preethi. So the last story we'll talk about is how we designed and iterated on the preview tooling in Android Studio for Compose based on user feedback. So in Compose, I think this is taken actually directly from developer.android.com, but at a high level, Compose is really, you build your UI by defining a set of these composable functions that simply take in data and then emit UI elements. And this is a little different from the XML approach, where you have a separation of concerns between your layout file, your activity or fragment, and other logic files like the view models, etc. Both Compose, everything is expressed in Kotlin, whether that's the UI or how to bind the data, it's all there. And so, next slide. To that extent, the UX question we asked ourselves is like, from a tooling perspective, how can we provide an experience that is complementary to this Compose paradigm that is different from XML? And so the approach we took is, even though we did want to complement the Compose paradigm, a lot of developers have used XML and the experiences we have around that, which is whether it's XML preview or the layout editor, there are great things in there that we wanted to continue to bring forward. But I think part of the interesting part is we wanted to really embrace code as the canvas. This is kind of a thing I could dive deeper on, but I think for this talk I won't go too far. But this idea that we've observed in previous research and some of our telemetry that more often than not, developers spend a lot of time in XML plus preview more than they do in the layout editor, which we've had with drag and drop. With drag and drop, I think we found that it's great for people to use to learn, and also for things like constraint layout. But overall, I think developers really are very comfortable with code and don't like the speed and iteration in which the XML plus preview workflow affords them. And so with Compose, because everything's in Kotlin and everything's really in one file, more or less, we want to figure out, is there a more of a code-centric approach that we could provide for preview tooling? And I think the third point on the approach is we really want to optimize for iteration and experimentation. Compose is new, and so I think the tooling experience has to be something that reinforces that learning and gets you really into the flow and allows you to experiment and understand the APIs more than you're used to. And so, I think for those who've tried Compose, this should look familiar. So, the idea is it's really, you have your code on the left, and then you have a preview on the right. Composables have to be annotated with the preview annotation to show up on the right. But it's all in Kotlin, so what you're seeing in the preview is compiled code. So if there's data binding or business logic or like a for loop or if conditions present in your UI code, it will show up in the preview. And we think actually this is powerful because it really gives you a much more realistic idea of what your UI will look like at runtime without actually having to deploy it to device. In some sense, actually, it's sort of a UI REPL environment. Because every composable is isolated, and each composable can be in its own preview. So in some sense, it gives you this little playground to iterate and kind of try things out without having to commit to it on a larger scale. And so I'm just going to walk through several examples of how preview has been used. It's very flexible, whether you're working on entire flows in your app or really like a single button. One thing that is very useful in Android is there's so many unique device configurations out there, especially with screen sizes. Having preview being allowed to display in various configurations side by side is a very useful thing that we've provided as well. On top of that is there's theming. So there's light theme and now there's dark theme. And so allowing developers to see that side by side is something we really wanted to allow folks to do. And then, if you're looking at specific button or specific components, like in this case, it's a button in the Jet News sample, you can also use preview to really look at the different states of a component. And this is very powerful in the sense, if you have a rich design system or a very clear componentry within your app, but also, you don't have to necessarily deploy your app every time to get to the specific state to see, is this button going to change red or blue? You can kind of mimic these states within preview side by side. And then lastly, I think in the more typical case, which we've seen more in XML workflows, is you can just work on the whole screen by itself. So, like I had mentioned earlier, preview is very flexible because you can look at an entire screen, you can look at a single button, you can look at a mix of components together. It's really up to you what you want to do with the API. And so, that's kind of what we landed on with the design, but, we did do a lot of research to figure out if we were actually going in the right direction with the preview tools. Since, because we don't have the layout editor right now, we want to make sure, is this departure something that resonates well with folks, or are we missing something that we need to address? So, Preethi was the researcher again. So in the research studies she had mentioned with the diary studies, we opportunistically folded some of the preview research studies within these same studies so that we could just ask them developers the same questions. A part of that was because on the homework assignment, they were actually coding in Compose and using the preview tools to go through the homework. And so it was a kind of a natural time to actually ask them questions about their experience as they went through the homework based on the tools they were using. And we've done this iteratively, and we've done it over all the studies that Preethi had mentioned. And then the last point, I think it really validates our current direction, I believe. But we also use it really to seek feedback on future ideas or how we can actually make the tools even better than what they are now. And just some quotes to taken from the studies. The refresh mode really helps people rapidly prototype. People love that they have the full power of Kotlin for creating these UIs, especially with sample data. That was always something that was a little awkward with XML, as you had to use this tools namespace to get the preview within Studio to look realistic. And so with Compose, you don't have to do that necessarily, because you can basically just pass state into a composable, which you would anyway at runtime. But then you can pass sample state or sample data or default data with parameters in Kotlin. And then the other one is just within the workflows. So because you're looking at each preview, now you can actually deploy each of those previews to a device. And that's pretty powerful, because you no longer have to hook up, your new component to some part of a flow in your app that may have multiple screens. Because often, I think in the previous workflows, you'd have to basically deploy the app and then get to a specific point in your app to actually test the new thing you just built, especially the interactivity and kind of like how it handles state changes. With Compose, that's much, much easier with the preview tooling. And so, to iterate the point on the slide, it made debugging and changing complex UIs much easier. And so, in the future, I think for tooling, I think there's many things we want to consider and improve upon. So I think one is code navigation. So there's so many composables now that can make up the hierarchy within your screens. And so how can we help developers navigate through that? Right now, like on the preview, you can click on each component, which will move the cursor to the definition of that component if it's in that file. If it's not, then you can double click and that will open up a corresponding Kotlin file where that composable is defined. But we want to keep going on that, because we realize that it's just as apps grow with complexity, that code navigation will become even more important for navigating the code base. Testing, we talked about how deploying to device is really great. We want to continue doing more on testing. I think from a performance standpoint, the preview tooling is not as fast as it could be, and we know this, especially if we look at the XML preview experience. That's kind of the bar. It's like very fast. And so we want to make preview as fast as possible. And so we're going to continue investing that as time goes on. And then I think the third thing is discovery. So while people are building these apps with Compose and learning about Compose, there's a lot of new APIs to use. And oftentimes it's not clear which component or composable or modifier to reach for to build out your whatever UI you're building. And so, can we make that more discoverable in the editor itself, like with autocomplete or suggestions or quick fixes, without necessarily needing developers to go to developer.android.com and like search for things. And so with that, that's kind of the end of our talk. But, to summarize, going back to the framework that Preethi had mentioned in the beginning, like this idea, respect the user. And for us, it's really how we do that is we want to build the most intuitive APIs, build usable but also intuitive tools, and then also provide useful intuitive docs or just guidance in general. And I think hopefully through these stories you've come to understand that UX or UX research is not just about doing research on the UI. It's really kind of a combination of understanding, especially in this context, how do developers break down problems? How do they learn? How do they perceive, structuring code, especially new code bases? And what are tools that we can build that help support this process and this learning journey, as well as also like guides or guidance and docs as well. So we still have a lot of work to do over the next until Compose goes stable, hopefully next year sometime. And we're excited to continue moving on and see where it's taking us and getting your feedback and really have it help. If you're interested in helping shape Compose further, we have this handy link to sign up for any user research opportunities. But yeah, thanks for listening, and we'll take questions now, if there are any.
Okay. So Sean says, great talk. Thank you.
expo. Guess we don't need to. Oh.
Okay. So our question is, Chris, did you want to take that?
Yes. I am not the most resident expert to answer this question fully, but oh, is there repeating? What's going on? Oh, yeah. So sorry, there's a lot of echo going on. Compose cycle tied to Andrew's life cycle. Yes, it is. I don't know the exact technicalities, but it is. Part of that is because when the composables have to recompose when they're shown back on the screen. But I think there's more to it, or more detail on developer.android.com. Next question, do we need view models in Compose? It's up to you, actually. There's actually a really great article that was released recently, or a guide, I should say, by Sean McQuillan, one of our DevRel advocates, that explains exactly how to manage state. So state can be managed through view model, if you're familiar with that, or with live data. But it can also be managed, I think in Compose, there's directly a concept called the mutable state of, which is one of the APIs that you can use to just do that. So it's pretty flexible. I would encourage you to check out that article about managing state in Compose, which gives you a lot of different approaches to how you can do it, even with existing libraries. So. That might be it.
Yep, maybe. I guess. Oh, we have one more question. It says, Hilt is cold, but I would like to know if we need it on Compose.
Oh. Okay. Yeah, I can try to answer that one as well. It's up to you. I don't know if it is supported fully right now. I'd have to check on that, but I think people do. Hilton is a dependency injection library, and so, or really a pattern. And I think people do want to continue using that, and so that is something that I think the team is keen on supporting with Compose. I don't know if you need it. That I think that's something I think one would have to decide based on the complexity of their app. But I believe it is something that the team will want to support going forward. So, app modularization. It's a good question. I think I don't know if we have any guidance yet on how one should architect their app when it comes to multiple modules. I think the team right now, I think I'm hoping, once Compose goes stable, that we'll have a better answer on that on developer.android.com. I think right now part of that story is also just we just released the navigation library in alpha, so I think navigation is a big piece to figure out. But I think part of that is also how to modularize your app, which I think hopefully will give guidance in the future. Question: when can we hope to see a stable Compose? As soon as possible. I'm crossing my fingers that maybe next year. Hopefully, we just hit alpha, which was a great milestone, and the team's working super hard for beta, and then at some point we'll go to stable. But stay tuned. But we're trying to move as fast as possible, so I'm hoping in sometime next year. Are there any tools to test accessibility on the composables? Good question. Yes, there is actually. I think it's in Canary now. On the preview, there is a view option where you can switch the preview to a couple we kind of call them lenses. You can either look at the preview at strictly as a design, as if a user would see it. You can look at it in a blueprint mode, which if you're familiar with constraint layout, it kind of looks more like a blueprint. It's more of a scaffold. But there's actually colorblind modes now. So it's something we've actually built for the XML experience, but we brought it into Compose. So now you can actually see, like, is your color, your color choices working well for, for those who have color deficiencies, vision-wise, or if it's accessible, meaning like, is there enough color contrast between the background and foreground? We want to continue to expand on our accessibility tooling for Compose. I think outside of tooling, there is also a lot of work going into making the Compose hierarchy accessible to screen readers so that one can navigate, which there is some support in XML, but we're working on that now for Compose. So yeah, we will continue to invest in accessibility tools for Compose. Yeah, if you want to connect with us, I think our Twitter handles were on that thank you slide, but yeah, my profile's open, so you can follow us on LinkedIn. And the last question is Compose accepting external contributions? Yes, I think the best place to get started, I don't have a handy link, but there is a README that shows what the process is for contributing to Compose. So Compose is within the Android X repository, which is hosted publicly on AOSP. So you have to pull that down first, and then within that repository there is the Compose parts repos within that, and that's where you can make contributions. I think also, even if you're not making contributions, I think we really encourage people, if you want to be involved with like how things are changing, or if you have like technical questions while you're trying out Compose, one of the best ways to get that support is there is a Kotlin Lang channel. It's in the Slack group for Kotlin Lang. I don't have the link, but I think it's on the landing page for Compose on developer.android.com. But there's a direct Slack channel called Compose, where a lot of the engineers on our team are there to answer questions that people have as they are developing and trying out Compose in their apps. So maybe that's a longer answer. So.
Yes, with that, that's probably about it, I guess.
I think so. Yep.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for chiming in and listening to our talk.
Yep. Thank you.